I think let's leap straight in. Mario, let's start with scope 1 and 2. So we hear these terms used all the time, and they're going to get used more and more in this industry. So when you're looking at scope 1 and 2, what are people talking about, and what should an organization be thinking about to mitigate?
Just briefly, when you talk about scope 1, mainly we're talking about the direct emissions of any company. So we're talking briefly about the day-to-day operations that are coming from the electricity consumption, your office operations, and the company-owned vehicles. So these are really the easy part, I would say, when reporting on your emissions. Scope 2 emissions would be anything that is indirect emissions but is feeding directly to your office operations. So mainly we're talking around electricity and steam and any kind of cooling and heating that is feeding into your offices. So it's the kind of emissions that someone else is doing on your behalf so that you can actually run your operations. So this is, in brief, I would say, what scope 1 and scope 2 emissions are.
Hanife, let's move to scope 3 and what this focuses on.
Okay, so scope 3 is value chain emissions. Sorry, I normally don't need a mic, I'm usually loud enough. So this is everything outside the organisation, so your supply chain emissions, it can be upstream or downstream, and tend to be the one that's perhaps the more difficult to quantify and has probably been the area or the emission sources that have typically haven't or historically haven't been a focus. So it's really been on scope 1 and 2, and so scope 3 can be very wide and varied in the way you measure, what you measure, and how you measure, and sometimes you'll see very different approaches by companies in terms of how far they'll go through to the scope 3 emissions. That's changing, I would say. We're starting to see some standardisation, a lot more pressure on organisations to start looking at scope 3. Investors, suppliers, and customers are wanting to understand more about what companies are doing around scope 3. So I think we're seeing a lot more focus on it, and we're seeing a lot more standardisation. It is very difficult because you are asking for others to quantify and provide that information. I have a personal view on scope 3. I think sometimes what I've seen when I've advised clients that the degree of granularity and detail that people want to get on scope 3 sometimes actually ends up causing more emissions, to be honest. The effort that goes into measuring scope 3 could generate more emissions. So I think it doesn't have to be absolutely accurate, but what you need to do is get a sense of where the risks and opportunities are in your scope 3 emissions. The other great thing that scope 3 emissions quantification gives you is an engagement piece with your customer suppliers, etc. And you'll be surprised that suppliers are looking at this a lot more than you would think. And I've got a current client at the moment who's engaging with their supply chain, construction materials, and were thinking that they would get resistance in terms of wanting their suppliers to quantify and start to assess their greenhouse gas emissions. But actually the supply chain was saying, well, we've got this great product that's got low emissions quantification. So that they're actually already looking at this, so you'd be quite surprised.
Mario, as Hanife has said, it's not easy. What kind of steps and work are you taking when you're advising clients, to actually make sure they're engaging with their supply chain, for instance?
Well, I mean, definitely scope 3 is the most tricky part. So the first advice I would say is, let's put some reasonable targets when we're talking about measuring your scope 3 emissions. Because first, you need to know that in terms of the reporting, in terms of the international certifications, as part of the GHG protocol, for example, scope 1 and scope 2 are mandatory. Scope 3 is not entirely mandatory. So because it's that tricky, we need to prioritize in terms of what we need to measure and what we don't really need to put too much time and too much investment in. So the first thing is, let's put some reasonable targets. Don't just put some aspirational targets and then try to figure out how to do it, because it's not going to work. And you definitely need to work a lot with your supply and value chain. And the nice thing about scope 3 emissions is, throughout this process, during this whole reporting and measuring process, you kind of have a much better idea about your own business, your own operations. Where does your carbon footprint actually lies? Because most of the emissions are actually part of scope 3, and then scope 2, and then scope 1. So once you have a very good idea about your scope 3 emissions, you have a better idea about how is your business operating, how you can optimize your value chain and your supply chain. And then also very important is that you can not only influence your own operations, but you can also influence the operations of your suppliers and the whole supply chain. So it kind of gives you this upper hand of choosing the right suppliers and influencing their own operations and giving them kind of a benchmark, saying that, you know, if you cannot actually meet this benchmark, we cannot work with you. So they would have the incentive in order to improve their own operations as well. So I think this is something very important. And as I said, you don't have to tackle all aspects of the Scope 3 emissions. Scope 1, as we said, direct emissions. Scope 2, indirect. As you can see on the slide, Scope 3, we're talking around 15 activities. So 8 upstream activities, 7 downstream activities. It's a very large span of activities. You don't have to tackle each and every one of them. You have to prioritize what's actually relevant to your business. Can you actually know for a fact how much they are? And to be very honest, we worked with lots of clients specifically on Scope 3 emissions where they didn't from the start have all of the data. So what we did is that we helped them give a certain estimation, a certain assumption. I would say, you know, more than 50-60% of Scope 3 based on our own expertise in this, because we've been monitoring and measuring our Scope 3 emissions for the last 10 years. So we have a very mature experience in this. We can definitely give them a very good and accurate idea about how much more or less their Scope 3 emissions is going to range about. And this is, as a first start, very important for them. And then a very good advice also is that, you know, it's fine to start at a certain point where you don't have all of the data and you're fine with just, you know, adapting as you move forward. This is something extremely important.
Okan, turning to you, I would bet that you know where your major emissions come from because of the business that you're in. So looking at that area of diesel generation, are there regulations in place that need to be in place in this region to try and cap those emissions? Because obviously we are very reliant on diesel generators or external generators for the construction sector.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is a really very important question, first of all, because I bring on table this subject time to time when we are discussing with the Chamber of Commerce and ministries, etc. As you know, we are operating all over the world, and some markets, some high-end markets is US and EU. Also, we have operations in the United States and also in Holland. And also, we have been supplied to Japan as well. And why these 3 countries I'm telling? Because they have very solid emission regulations for non-road products. What does mean non-road diesel engines? This is the generators, excavators, and that kind of industrial diesel engines. This is out of cars and automobiles and trucks, that kind of movable items. And this is very important. Of course, definitely all over the world there's regulations about the emission for automobile sector or vehicle sector. But for the non-road diesel engines, for example, US started in 96. European Union started in 99 around. And they diversified their program for continuous and rental operation and also standby operation for 2 different regulations for these 2 different kind of usage. And so they come step by step. Actually, it goes in the US tier standards goes up to tier 4. It starts from tier 1. Gradually, they announced around 2013, 2014, tier 4 final. And with tier 4 final, they could reduce the emission output almost 98%. Okay. Actually, when you compare with standard generators in the EU, even actually they are working on more, and they announced in 2019 stage 5. Stage 5, this is the little bit over standards when you compare the global standardization. Why I'm telling over? Because now regulation from the regulation authorities, the engine manufacturers, equipment manufacturers like us, we are always asking to start standardization also to be able to produce same kind of product for different regions. Otherwise, when there's a different regulations and all over the world, it's very difficult to diversify your product, and you need to change your production line. You need to separate your production line for different products, because these are very special engines and equipment, maybe 3-4 times expensive than standard one. But of course, it deserves. And it's not easy application, just adding a small filter or something like that.
So what you're saying is that this region, you know, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, etc., we need to start looking at regulations for off-highway diesel generation.
In this region, especially UAE, has a large vision about green energy and investing a lot about that. Definitely, even I'm sorry that we are a little bit late to start. We should start as quick as possible. And why we want that? Because maybe it can reduce in the first batch our volume about the revenue-wise. But we don't mind, because we would like to compete with high-end, high-quality brands which has successful R&D teams, which can contribute something for development of the country and environment, instead of just competing with the low-cost, low-quality products, and which doesn't actually feed our business climate.
Okay, all right. So Hanife, moving to back to you. I want to write for my company the strategy that will form our policies and our plans in the future for our decarbonisation. Maybe I'll even be grand and call it that we're going to be net zero by 2045. What am I doing wrong, you know?
Well, first of all, is naming a target or putting in a target, announcing a target without actually doing some of the legwork first. And don't be surprised, I've had many a client that's had a very senior executive who's about to hop on a plane to go to Davos or somewhere, and it's like, oh, we need to announce something. Let's just announce we're going net zero. And that's all fine and good, but if you haven't engaged your investors and you haven't engaged your broader stakeholders, it could be quite a shock to them. So I think, you know, if you're going to look at decarbonisation as a strategic initiative within your organisation, you have to start with just a simple baseline. Understand where you're at, understand what's at risk, what value is at risk if you decide to go net zero at a certain period in the horizon, the forecast.
But how do you get to that baseline? What I'm trying to understand in a way is, how do you form that baseline? How do you know?
So, I mean, there's lots of frameworks that can help you with that. So the Science-Based Targets Initiative, and there's a lot of other initiatives that can give you frameworks to do that. But essentially, it's just calculating where you're at. And again, as Mario and I was talking about, it doesn't have to be absolutely accurate at that very early stage. You just need to understand exactly, you know, for example, your heat map. Where are your most emissions-intensive activities, assets, infrastructure in your portfolio of activities as a business? And then if you need to go and drill down further, do so. But at the very early stages, get a sense of what that heat map looks like. Where are the risks and where are these great opportunities to start, I don't know, changing your business model? Do you actually start to take on some downstream activities, because then you can control some of the emissions and drive greater innovation? So, you know, these are the things that you need to look at the very early stages, and then also look at, if we decide to go down a net zero path, or if we decide to change materials, what does that do to your margins? What does it do to your profitability, and et cetera, et cetera? So then once you've kind of done that quantification piece and you've got an idea and you work through, the next step would be to take all that data and work through some scenarios. So what does scenario A look like at this particular milestone, at this particular rate of decarbonisation, and run those scenarios through. And also, I cannot stress this enough, do a financial model, because you need to understand what impact does it have on your margins, your profit margins, etc. Not just now, into the future. Remember, there are governments around the world that are increasingly implementing a price on carbon. We know that Europe has got a tariff, an import tariff that's a carbon tariff. So these are factors you need to start to embed into your financial models as well. And I've seen work being done that doesn't model some of this impact, or it's coming back with really, what can I say, very loose impacts on margins, which I've questioned and challenged. So I think that's really important. And I think, so you understand, you take the data, you run it through your models, and then you start to set some reasonable, realistic targets. And then it comes to the implementation and the monitoring. So how do you do that? You know, what are the systems to monitor? The other thing around implementation that I think it needs a great focus is this is a change management piece, right? And it is a great opportunity to engage with your stakeholders. Tell your investors what you're trying to do, what benefits it will drive to the organisation in terms of efficiencies, value creation. You know, we may have a portfolio of assets that are going to be decarbonised. My assets compared to some brownfield assets is going to look far more attractive to an investor. Use this as a lever to go and get cheaper debt. It's happening. We are seeing much more appetite by capital markets to look at buildings that have not just carbon or green smarts, I call them, but looking at things like social welfare, the well-being, other elements, including accessibility to buildings. So there's an array of things that can come with the implementation piece as well. And the other thing I'll say about implementation that I think is an opportunity is collaboration. A lot of the technology, a lot of the information, again, if it's downstream, upstream, you need to work with your suppliers, you need to work with other parties to bring the best solutions to market, to help you on your decarbonisation path, but to also help others. So I think partnerships, collaboration, information sharing is also a really, really important piece of the implementation.
Mario, talking about engaging stakeholders, working with partners, and I can see, you know, the benefit of doing that. We also have COP28 around the corner. It's very hard to imagine that there are not going to be some sort of initiatives or expectations placed on the construction sector or the built environment, so post-handover, around decarbonisation in the run-up to COP28. Do you expect that?
I definitely expect that. This is something, it's not just an expectation, it's a definite truth because, I mean, for many reasons. First, we're on a very steep decarbonisation pathway. We're in what we call now the definitive, 10-year cycle that we are in from now till 2030. We don't really have much time. So regardless of, COP28 or the UAE, the decarbonisation pathway by itself is very steep. So everyone should actually just, try to fathom how much crucial it is in order to reduce our carbon emissions as much as possible. The other reason is obviously UAE. I mean, when you have COP28 in UAE, this is another level because, I mean, we all know that UAE doesn't enter into something without, giving this, I would say, the wow effect. I mean, we've seen the Expo, and we've seen how much effort, how much investment, how much differentiation was there compared to any other Expo. So what about COP28? Already there are many things that are happening behind closed doors. We cannot really, disclose of much now, but you can definitely know for a fact that we're going into, another level in terms of the regulations, in terms of what's actually going to be required from all companies, from all organizations. Hanife already talked a bit about, the carbon pricing, the internal carbon issues. So definitely we're going to see some major differentiators within the UAE.
For whatever part of the sector you're in, whether be that build or operating, running buildings.
Obviously, we're talking about all different sectors of the real estate, of the construction industry, being the industry that has a very high input into the carbon emissions. Even on a state level, we're going to see lots of state-driven initiatives, I would say, because obviously as much as organizations can do, but still the government, the public sector has lots also to work on, especially when, for example, we saw from the Scope 2 emissions, this is the electricity-driven emissions. So you have to decarbonize your whole grid. And this is something that the government is definitely responsible for. So, I mean, everyone expects this. UAE is going definitely for this one. It's something to look forward to. It's definitely a space to watch. Just going back a bit also on your, I would say, on your question regarding the process, on top of everything that Hanife already explained in very detail. So just visually speaking, it's a four-step process, right? It's something that, when you break it down, it becomes, very easy to understand. First, like Hanife said, understand where you are. You really need to have a benchmark, your first step, where do you actually stand, what you are actually doing now, and then go into reducing your carbon footprint, putting science-based targets, and then offsetting your carbon emissions, and most importantly, at the end, report on whatever you are doing. You can choose whatever reporting mechanism that you need, international certifications, there are many out there, but as a very simply put step process, we're talking just about, these four steps. It's not as easy as it sounds, of course, but then once you start, you put a benchmark to yourself, and then everything is, comes easier down the road.
How do you see your side of things decarbonizing in the coming years? Is it more and more hybrid, moving eventually to battery and solar?
Yeah, definitely. There are many ways to reduce carbon, and also clean energy is, of course, preferable. But on the other hand, we are still depends on fossil fuel powered equipments, and so we try to combine, because of this reason, still in this century, because to be able to provide security of the energy to the site. What we are doing about that, I can give some example. This is from AKSA, but of course this is a kind of sector dynamics. And hybrid products, traditionally it started from telecom sector, because antenna stations, they are putting the generators at the top of the mountains, as you know, and it's very difficult actually to maintain, and also refueling that one, and sending somebody. Sometimes even weather conditions affects that to reach at the top of the mountain to serve the product over there. So we created a product, hybrid. It can be combined solar energy, the compact product, solar, diesel generators. At the same time, lithium type batteries, which we can store energy. Of course, the important part of this hybrid systems, not just compact type we are doing that. Let me say this first. We are also doing as a big power plants. As you know, AKSA is also a big energy company, except for generator manufacturer globally. So we do also hybrid plants, especially in Africa. We started the last couple of years to do similar kind of the plants, but much larger scale. In Somalia, in some other countries, in very difficult conditions, working conditions, we had completed, and they are operating now. The really important part of this kind of product is, of course, digital transformation, because we cannot connect this type of energy sources manually to each other. It should connect with very smart system, and this is the key point of the system. And when the solar system is gonna work and feed the site, when the generator is gonna start, when the amp of the lithium battery is getting a certain level, then it's gonna start. When we are gonna use lithium batteries or inverters, because some of them is DC power, some of them AC power, you need to convert to each other correctly to power the site. In this way, what is the advantage? Of course, we are definitely getting reduce the OPEX, and also, but the most important then, we are contributing about the decarbonization with that kind of product, because using the diesel generator less. At the same time, on the other hand, we can say that in this, based on this forum, of course, we are talking about the new technologies. And now, not based on just watt flowings to the site. This is a kind of watts and bytes collaboration, I am calling in that way. Okay. Then this is the technique. This is the also electronic part of the this system, controlling part of this system.
So, final words, Mario and Hanife. Is the benchmarking available in this region?
So for the built environment, I think commercial's better. Resi is a much more difficult process, but that's actually a problem globally to find benchmarks around carbon intensity for the residential sector, obviously because of the models that we have, you know. But there are some robust models in terms of commercial buildings particularly, yes. And we are working to develop some of those benchmarks in the region because they're, you know, regionally it's a much more, the data's just not there, so we're working with companies to come up with some of those benchmarks.
Yes, definitely agree. I think we also rely a lot on international benchmarks, to be honest, especially with many businesses that have different offices worldwide. So this is something that becomes a bit more easy, and try to, I would say, you know, just have a local application of their benchmarks. So yeah, definitely that's what's happening now. Just one final word. I think decarbonization is more of a strategic business decision than it is a technical decision. So I think every organization should definitely know that. It's not something that is technically driven. It's something that starts at the top. You need to have definitely kind of a sustainability committee that reports directly to your board of directors, to the management. Otherwise, it's not really going to work.